Introduction, and then we will start. Dr. Joe Uziel is an archaeologist at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Jerusalem district, where he has excavated the city of David, Davidson Center, and Western Wall tunnels. Dr. Uziel completed his PhD at Bar Ilan University on the Middle Bronze Age and Southern Coastal Plain, and now focuses his research on the history and archaeology of Jerusalem, from its earliest urban establishment some 4,000 years ago and until late antiquity. Dr. Uziel has advanced methods applied in the field using new technologies in order to learn about Jerusalem's ancient population through the application of new tools. Recent discoveries made by Dr. Uziel and his teams in the field include buildings dating from the First Temple period, the main street of Second Temple, Jerusalem, and a Roman theater-like structure, the first such building to be discovered in Jerusalem. Recently, he has taken the position of the head of the Dead Sea Scrolls unit at the Israel Antiquities Authority. So with that, Dr. Uziel, welcome to CSP, and everybody, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Aria, and I hope you can all hear me okay. There's a lot of challenges with these electronic forums, so I hope everyone can hear everything okay. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so the nice background behind me will be less prominent, but you'll see it later on as we go through the slideshow. Just Aria, if you can give me a thumbs up and tell me you see my screen so I know that. Does everyone see my screen? Okay, so
I don't see your screen yet, so just so you know.
You don't see my screen, okay.
No. But it could be my computer, so try it again. Ah, okay. Now it's coming up.
I stopped sharing. Okay, 1 second. I stopped sharing. I think the connection's a bit slow.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. All right. So we're going to be talking about some of the new insights on the archaeology of Jerusalem based on the recent excavations. I've been excavating in Jerusalem for about a decade now. And I will just say that something that I very largely avoided back in the days when I was working with Ahuva further to the west at the site of Gath of the Philistines. But about 10 years ago, I was offered the opportunity to join the excavations in Jerusalem by the Israel Antiquities Authority, which is the government body which runs the excavations in the country. And basically, I grabbed it with two hands. And since then, I've been immersed in Jerusalem 100%. So I'm going to try and give a little bit of background of everything. First of all, when we think about Jerusalem, and especially if you haven't been to Jerusalem, or if you've only been to Jerusalem, here and there, you often think about ancient Jerusalem in terms of the area up here, if you can see my mouse, which is the area of the Old City, the area of the Temple Mount. And these are very important areas. And in fact, they are part of Jerusalem's ancient core, but they're not the oldest part of Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem's settlement doesn't begin in the Old City, which is now surrounded by the Ottoman walls, but it actually develops on a small, narrow hill to the south, where this white arrow is pointing. And the reason that the city develops there, or the settlement develops there, is that has something which the upper mound does not have, and that you can see to the right of your screen is a natural spring. If I'm an ancient town builder or town planner, there are a couple of things that I look for when I'm planning my town and where to put it. And one of them is a place where I can protect pretty easily against attackers from outside the city. And that exists in quite a lot of hilltops in the Jerusalem area, because we're talking about a hilly area. But something that doesn't exist everywhere is water. And water is very, very important, because water is the source of life in ancient times. Without water, you can't have agriculture, you can't grow food, food, water is used in a lot of types of production. And so having a steady water source is a very, very important part in choosing where you place your site. And in fact, what we know about Jerusalem is that the earliest settlement on the site begins some roughly 5,000 years ago, with buildings constructed very, very close to the area of the spring, down on the lower parts of the hill. And slowly that little small settlement expands more and more and extends over the area of the entire, what we call Southeastern Hill, or what you may know as the City of David. The City of David is a small hill which is very, very well defined by two very deep valleys, one of which you can see in the picture. If I move my mouse, you can see here the Kidron Valley. At the base of the hill in the Kidron Valley is where the spring emanates from. And on the other side, there is just as deep of a valley known as the Central Valley or the Tyropian Valley. And that valley you don't see very well, it's covered up, and you'll see a little bit later on in our lecture why it gets covered up, but you'll have to take my word for it and believe me when I say that right around here, an additional valley runs, which basically secludes the area of this small hill of the City of David. In later times, of course, the settlement expands towards the north to include the area of the Temple Mount, upon which, in the first temple period, a temple is built. It is then destroyed in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. And then some 70 years later, the temple is rebuilt and expands slowly over time until it reaches its peak in the late Second Temple period, roughly 2,000 years ago. And if you come to visit Jerusalem and you look at things like the Western Wall, you're actually looking at the wall, or the Western Wall, there are 4 of them, which hold up the platform upon which the Second Temple was built. Now, I'm not nearly the first to excavate in Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem is one of the most extensively and intensively excavated sites, not only in Israel, but in the world. Jerusalem draws a lot of interest, obviously, because of its importance to Judaism, to Christianity, to Islam, and archaeology in Israel, or archaeology in the Holy Land, as we may call it, has been quite driven by its connection and its importance to important religions. And so beginning in the mid-19th century, we have explorers and American explorers and German explorers coming to Jerusalem and doing archaeological work. And their archaeological work is important. And over those 150 years, or even more now, 170 years, I'd say, methods develop more and more. And one of the biggest challenges in arriving in Jerusalem, a site that's been so extensively excavated, is what else can I learn? So much has been done, 150 years of archaeological work. What else can I contribute as a scholar coming to Jerusalem? And I hope in the next few minutes we'll be able to understand that there is still a lot to learn about Jerusalem, and especially by integrating new methods which weren't around 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, we can learn new pieces of information which weren't explored by past explorers. Just as a quick note, I want to mention that recent archaeologists love to argue. I mean, we love to argue more than anyone else, I think. The idea that the city developed from the area of the spring, as I explained before, and then later expanded northward towards the Temple Mount and westward towards what we know as Mount Zion, or the southwestern hill, in the area of the Jewish Quarter, for example, was basically the very, very well accepted core idea in the way in which Jerusalem developed. But recently, some scholars have suggested that perhaps the site developed first on the Temple Mount and then spread towards the south, towards the City of David, and towards the southwestern hill at the same time. The main reason that I don't accept this premise is basically it ignores two very important pieces of information. One is it ignores the importance of having a natural spring available to you and basically utilizing it. But more importantly, it largely ignores the archaeological data which has been uncovered in the city of David over the past 150 years. And so I think we're still basically looking at our left side of our screen, option A, as the primary option. And so I'll actually begin with a discussion of some of the recent things that we've been exposing in the city of David. And then later on, we'll move further north towards not the Temple Mount itself, because there are no excavations on the Temple Mount, but very, very close to the Temple Mount in our excavations in the Western Wall tunnels. Okay, so here we have a reconstruction of what the first city of Jerusalem may have looked like. And of course, this is very, very maximalist, okay? This is like the biggest it could have possibly been. But what I want you to notice mostly is where the black arrow is emanating from. And the black arrow is its starting point is actually where the spring is located. Now, if the spring is Jerusalem's most important natural resource, and we know that as opposed to, for example, other sites, let's say in Lebanon, where an important resource would have been the cedar wood, or sites in the Negev area, which would have had copper oring, and so there were other natural resources. In the area of Jerusalem, we're largely talking city. You need to plan not just having a water source, but protecting that water source, because if you don't protect that water source, then in any attack, basically the water source can be cut off, and then you can very quickly be conquered. And so very, very important to Jerusalem's urban development would have been protecting and manipulating that water source. And over the excavations of about 150 years, many, many, many different water sources were exposed, different water systems and fortifications were exposed, the most famous of which is known as the Siloam Tunnel or Hezekiah's Tunnel, which in the 8th century BCE, prior to the Assyrian attack on Jerusalem, according to at least the more conservative opinion, which I tend to agree with, Hezekiah carves a tunnel, moving the water from the spring here in the rock underneath all the houses of the city and bringing it to the southern end of the city into a very, very large pool of water known as the Siloam Pool. From that point on, the Siloam Pool at the southern end of the city becomes the main water source. The water is fed from the spring, but the spring is no longer the point that's accessed. But prior to that point, the spring needed to be protected. And so one of the first things that we see in Jerusalem's city is the construction of very, very large fortifications. These walls marked in yellow, okay, right here, which surround the spring and protect them. Now, I would like to show you pictures of it, but I really, really recommend, as Aryeh mentioned, coming to Israel on your next trip, even if it's a year and a half away now because of the COVID virus, and basically taking a look at these incredible constructions, which are thousands of years old, built of huge stones, standing to a height of some 7 meters, so from roughly converting to feet, it's about 20 feet tall, walls that are about 18 feet thick, something that's very, very massive. And when they were originally exposed, the excavators, Ronnie Racanelli Shuk, dated these structures to about 3,700 years ago, at a period where Jerusalem was settled by what we can generally call Canaanites, what the Bible may call Jebusites. And of course, archaeology does not have the capability to ethnically identify these people, and know what they were calling themselves, but we're roughly talking about the same culture that settled the entire land of Israel and the entire southern Levant. And they dated these structures to that period for several different reasons. First of all, here you could see some pictures. This is Roni Reich standing next to one of the stones. So you can just get an idea. The stone is about 2 meters high, about 1.5 meters wide. To think about moving these types of stones, and this is just one of many, many stones, into place at a time when there was no mechanical equipment is quite impressive. And here you can see Eli Shukrun, who is standing against one of the walls. And if Eli Shukrun is about 5'10", you can get an idea of how well preserved these fortifications are. And again, they're dating them to about 3,700 years ago, at a time when the Canaanites were settled in Jerusalem. Now, the reasoning behind their dating was several-fold. Here you can see some reconstructions of what this may have looked like to an attacking army, what they would have had to overcome in order to try and cut off the water source, and what it would have looked like from the inside with the houses looking down, walking down within a fortified area in order to fetch their water from the spring, and then turn around and hike back up. And whenever these fortifications were built, they obviously served their purpose, because one of the things that we learn about Jerusalem is that, as opposed to many of the other sites in the country, that we meet destruction after destruction after destruction, in Jerusalem, we are very, very short of destructions. In fact, for the early periods and running all the way up to the Second Temple period, we can really talk about 2 destructions. One, which is in 70 AD, 70 CE, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, which is a very, very, very massive destruction. And the other one is the 586 BC destruction by the Babylonians. And so these fortifications obviously serve their purpose, because for hundreds of years, no conquering army was able to destroy Jerusalem. And we know that there were conquering armies running around trying to. For example, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, who comes to Jerusalem and tries to destroy it. And in the end, he ends up leaving. Of course, he explains it differently than the Bible, but in the bottom line is he doesn't get his way, he doesn't destroy Jerusalem. And we also have indications from the biblical text that about 100 years earlier, the Aramean armies tried to do the same thing. And if I go back to Gath of the Philistines, one of the other major sites in the country at the time, we know that the Arameans, both archaeologically and textually, we have evidence that the Arameans destroyed the site completely. And apparently they tried to do the same thing to Jerusalem, and it didn't work out. And it's most likely because of these massive fortifications protecting both the city, but also its water source. Now, all of this very much made sense in terms of archaeological logic, and I don't want to get too into it because we'll run out of time very quickly. But beyond the archaeological logic that I mentioned here, one of the most important things that led them to this conclusion that Jerusalem's fortifications should be dated to 36, 37, 3,800 years ago were a group of texts discovered in Egypt, written on bowls and figurines that cursed many of the cities in the region of Israel, okay, in the region of Canaan. And one of the cities that is very likely mentioned in these texts is Jerusalem. And so the archaeologists who exposed these fortifications said, in order to have a city in Jerusalem, you needed to protect its water source. And if the Egyptians are mentioning this city, then we must have here a connection between our historical records and our archaeological record. We can say these fortifications were built in the Middle Age some 3,500 years ago. when we began excavating, when I took over the project some 10 years ago, we began excavating buildings which were built up against these fortifications. And these buildings dated to much, much later. They dated to the 9th century BCE, a period when Jerusalem was no longer Canaanite. It was now actually under Judite control. There was a Judite monarchy, okay? The united monarchy of David and Solomon had already split, and we had two separate kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and Judah's capital was Jerusalem. Now, I just want to make a side note here, because I'm sure some of you are asking yourselves, wait a second, you just skipped over David and Solomon, and that's probably one of the most important periods that you're looking for. Truth be told, yes, it would be nice to find, but the bottom line is, at least archaeologically, we have not found a lot of evidence for Jerusalem of the 10th century BCE. Now, this has led to many, many arguments, and some of you may have read a recent article in the New Yorker, which was published, which basically interviewed Israel Finkelstein, Professor Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, that describes David as a sort of bandit running around and charismatically gathering people behind him, but without a real capital, without a real kingdom. The bottom line is that I think, and I'm saying this hesitantly as you can tell, that archaeology doesn't have all the answers. And sometimes what you don't find doesn't necessarily mean what wasn't there. So sometimes we don't find things that were there, and that's just part of the game. And so I think we need to base ourselves more with what we are finding and less with what we're not finding. And so I skip over the 10th century because we really don't know a lot about it archaeologically, but we do know a lot about 9th century BCE, Jerusalem. And there we're finding a lot of important remains all over the city, everywhere we excavate. And some of those remains are built up against these fortifications. And so what we are understanding is whoever is building up these structures in the 9th century and using these fortifications obviously has enough power to organize labor, to put in the effort into building a city. And not only that, but is involved in trade with other entities, as we'll get to in a minute. And so we see that Jerusalem is really blossoming in the 9th century BCE. And here you can see patches of what seem to be reconstruction of these fortifications at a certain period. So it's not just the building of these fortifications, but it's their maintenance. It's keeping them up over time. I don't want to bore you too much with archaeological sections, but I will show you a photo of the tower. Now, after Roni Reich and Eli Shukron began to expose the tower, we continued to expose the tower, and we came upon the opportunity to date the tower because we wanted to get hard, solid evidence, not just speculation of linking the construction of these fortifications with those texts from Egypt. And so we basically exposed its outer face, and we saw that its lower courses, the lower stones of this tower, were not built on bedrock, but they were built on layers of soil. And layers of soil contain materials that can be datable. Archaeological datable materials can be many, many things. It can be ceramics, for example, which we can date roughly to periods of usually about between, I'd say, 50 to 100 years. And so if we find certain types of ceramics, we may be able to use those to date the fortifications. In later periods, when we get to the Second Temple period, we'll talk about coins. And coins are extremely important because coins many times, just as coins today, have specific years. And then we can get to very, very fine-tuned dating. But in this case, we didn't have pottery and we didn't have coins. But what we did have was organic remains. And organic remains are extremely important because up until, I'd say about 7 or 8 years ago, we were not using a very, very important technology in Jerusalem that is used all over the world archaeologically, and that's radiocarbon dating. Basically takes organic remains which have isotopes in them, and one specific isotope, carbon-14, which has a half-life, and uses it to measure the dates. Now, this method has been around for, I'd say, roughly about 60 or 70 years, if I'm not mistaken. It's been highly improved in the past, I'd say, 15 years or so, and even in the past couple of years, in the past few years, it's even been even more and more improved. So it's constantly being improved, and we basically had the opportunity to come and say, well, they've been talking about Middle Bronze Age, about Canaanite Jerusalem. Let's see if they're right. And we made 2 sections beneath this tower that was built on soil. And basically we came up with completely different dates. And if I mentioned that Jerusalem of the 9th century BCE seems to be a bustling city, well organized with a powerful government, that's what we're getting in our radiocarbon dates. Because as opposed to the dating that we thought was correct, somewhere around 3,700 years ago, we can now talk about almost 1,000 years later, or 900 years later, the construction of these towers. And if not the construction, then at the very least, their repair. And so I think that when we're talking about Jerusalem, we can really see a very, very sharp development in the 9th century BCE using our new methods. Not only are we getting construction of fortifications, of different buildings, but we're getting a lot of different finds. For example, here we have a small sherd which has a Hebrew inscription carved on it, okay? It's only part of the inscription, and the importance is not the name mentioned, which is, here you have an ancient Dalet, a hay. It seems to be the leg of possibly several letters. And then we have here a mem, an ancient mem, and here we have parts of an ancient shin. So we have here an ancient Hebrew inscription from about 2,800 years ago, sorry. But the importance of this inscription is that we see there's writing in ancient Jerusalem in the 9th century. And this is important because in the ancient world, writing is very, very closely linked to administrative complexity. And so we're starting to see different aspects of that complexity. And not only that, but we see these little small clumps of clay here that you can see, and they're stamped. These are basically similar to what you would think about if I always like to use the movie Robin Hood, where you see Lady Marian rolling up a letter that she wants to send, and she takes wax and she pours it on the edge of the letter that she's rolled up, and then she puts her stamp on it in order to make sure that nobody opens it until it reaches its addressee. So here we have the same idea, except instead of using wax, they would use small bits of clay, and they stamp them. And at this point in time in the 9th century BCE, what they're using are different symbols, iconography, that they stamp on these pieces of clay in order to close up containers or letters that were sent from different places in the Judean kingdom to Jerusalem. And whatever these containers were holding, here a group of pottery, which arrives in Jerusalem, which arrives from a very interesting place. It actually arrives from that site, or one of those sites in the southern coastal plain, known as a Philistine site. And the way we know it is we can examine the clay that was used to produce these vessels, and we can see that they're not locally made in Jerusalem, but they're brought from afar. They're brought from the sites of Philistia. And here we get a very, very interesting picture of 9th century Jerusalem that's not only involved in administration and writing and construction fortifications, but they're involved in trade. And who are they trading with? They're trading with who we would expect to be their arch enemies, the Philistines. Now, this is interesting because when we go back to the biblical text, and of course, as archaeologists, we're not biblical scholars, and so we have to try and use it carefully, but we can see that the biblical text is quite complex in explaining the relationship between the Philistines and Judah. And although at times these two entities seem to be at each other's throats, there are other times where there seems to be some sort of better relationship. And one of the cases, for example, is when David runs off to Gath of the Philistines when he's escaping from Saul. And so here we may have archaeological evidence to show that this relationship was very, very well developed, or at least had trade going on. Here you could see fuller forms of these pots from sites in Philistia, which basically, those small sherds that I showed you are pieces of these same types of pots. And so basically we're seeing that 9th century Jerusalem is a very, very complex city with a strong government, fortifications, trade, administration, writing, and so on and so forth. I want to now go to the area that's marked in this small green square, which we've been excavating for the past 3 years, and which has had quite some interesting finds. First of all, Ronnie Reich and Ali Shukran, and I keep referring to them. So just so you understand, I'm talking about the team of archaeologists that excavated at the site prior to my arrival. So they excavated up until 2011, or until the end of 2011 at the site, at which point I began excavating. And here you can see a very, very unique complex of rock cut rooms. Now, usually when we excavate houses from the First Temple period, you'll see the houses are built of stones, usually actually small, uncut, rough stones built on top of each other. But here, what they actually did was they carved out the houses or the structures into the bedrock, and they formed the walls out of the bedrock. And these walls also include all kinds of strange features. And Reich and Shukran suggested that this may be some kind of cultic complex. Now, this is of interest because we're talking about First Temple period Jerusalem. And so why would you have cult when you have the temple, although it's farther up, but you should have only one place of worship in Jerusalem? As we'll see in a moment, our concept of First Temple Jerusalem may not be as righteous as later Second Temple period Jerusalem. And First Temple period Jerusalem, they were using things that we not necessarily think would be in line with the written law. For example, we find many, many, many figurines. Now, figurines are, of course, against the written law, but we still find them in just about every house that we excavate in Jerusalem. And another thing that we find is here you see a room just above these rock cut rooms, which we excavated, and you can see here that they were smashed vessels here. And in between these vessels, which you can see here, once again, as we expose them, you can see here this small head. That's the head of a very, very small pig, which we excavated in this room. And the way we reconstruct this scenario is that this is some kind of room where there was storage. You had these jars here that probably held commodities. And at some point in time, something happens in Jerusalem, somewhere in the 8th century BCE, where the room collapses and gets destroyed. And this little piglet gets stuck in between these jars and finds its end. Why is this piglet so important? Because, as you know, in Jewish law today, and actually this goes way back, pig is not a kosher animal. And in fact, it has a very, very extreme taboo in culture today. And that taboo goes way far back, at least till the Second Temple period. And some scholars have even argued that it should extend back all the way to the earliest beginnings of the Israelite culture, some 3,200 years ago. because for the most part, we do not find pig bones in the archaeological excavations of sites related to the tribes of Israel, to Judah. And so some scholars have developed this into the idea that they prevented themselves from eating pork. And the reason that they did so was because those Philistines, which we mentioned before, were actually consuming quite a lot of pork. But in the case we have here, we see that they were not only consuming small amounts of pork, but they were still consuming pork in Jerusalem, but they were also raising the pigs at the time. And so we understand that this taboo may not have been as strict as we once thought for First Temple period Jerusalem. And as I mentioned before, in general, our idea of Jerusalem of the First Temple period indicates that although there was a written law and it had many, many prohibitions, there was a lot of, I'd say, people who weren't keeping that to the letter of the law. I just want to show you for a minute, these same rooms where we found this pig actually have a very, very, very long life. They undergo some kind of destruction, again, in the mid-8th century BCE. It's not a very, very large destruction. It doesn't cover the entire site. And we're sort of trying to figure out what that could have been that caused the destruction. But then they very, very quickly resettle these buildings. And you can see the little blue tags marking various surfaces, which were basically the living surfaces in these buildings, extending from somewhere roughly, let's say around 750 BCE and all the way till 586 BCE. In 586 BCE, I'll go back to that in a minute, Jerusalem is destroyed, and we'll take a look at that in a minute because these buildings don't show signs of destruction, but we'll see other buildings which do. Now, one of the important things that we found in these rooms are, you remember those clumps of clay, these stamps, these that we call boule, which were used in order to stamp letters. Well, if in the 9th century they were using pictures, by the 8th century they were using names. And these names teach us a lot about the officials living, working in Jerusalem. Some of them have very, very important names. Some of them have the names mentioned in the Bible. We can reconstruct lineages. And in the one before you right here, we can actually read in ancient Hebrew letters, Le'achiav ben Menachem. Now, Menachem, of course, we know the name Menachem from the Bible as one of the kings of Israel. And we also know the name, not Ahab. These are two kings of Israel. Now, the official stamping, this small piece of clay, which closed a letter, was not one of the kings of Israel who had founded Jerusalem later. But what is important here is that whoever this individual was has a lineage of using these names and being called or being named after kings of Israel. And this may be an indication of the people living in the late 8th century BCE, because what is that in 723 BCE, the Assyrians destroy the kingdom of Israel. And many, many refugees begin to scatter across the country. And some of those refugees arrive in Jerusalem. And some of those refugees actually find their way into key positions in Jerusalem's administration. And it's possible that we're looking at some evidence for specific that. Okay, I'm gonna move ahead. I think we have roughly about 20 minutes. Aryeh, is that roughly right?
Yeah, about 15 minutes or so, I would say.
15 minutes, okay. So last slide, First Temple Jerusalem, and then we're gonna jump ahead to Second Temple Jerusalem. So here you can see remains of the destruction of 586 BCE that were found in these same buildings. You see the smashed pots, you see the black markings, which are the markings of charcoal, which probably held up the ceiling of this room. and burnt down and fell on top of these pots and destroyed the city in 586 BC. But as I mentioned before, Jerusalem quickly revives, and it revives some 70 years later in the Persian period, and the temple is rebuilt, and people begin to move back and to resettle Jerusalem. And Jerusalem reaches its peak roughly 2,000 years ago in the 1st century BCE or 1st century CE, at the time of a king named Herod, who you probably have heard of, and subsequently after his death to a time when the city is ruled by Roman governors known as procurators, the most famous of which is Pontius Pilate, and he's infamous, of course, for the crucifixion of Jesus, until it reaches its end in 70 CE. In 66 CE, the Jews rebel against the Roman Empire. The rebellion lasts 4 years, and in 70 CE, the city is destroyed. What we're looking at here are two important reconstructions for our discussion. The first just shows the extent of the city at its greatest height, and here you could see the area of the Temple Mount, and you could see the 4 walls. This is the western wall, the northern wall, the eastern wall, and the southern wall. And you see that this is the area of the city of David, which was settled from already earlier on, but now is known as the lower city, and the area up here of the upper city. And the elites were probably living in the upper city. And then there's new neighborhoods extending way beyond. And what happens is Jerusalem, as it expands, it needs to expand its fortified area as well. And so you have several lines of fortifications. Now, one of the advantages that we have for Second Temple period Jerusalem is that we also have very, very good historical documentation by Josephus Flavius, who particularly describes the events of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, but he also describes in detail many of the features that we're exposing archaeologically, including the Temple Mount. On our right, you can see the main street of Jerusalem running along the city of David, and this street connects the two main points of interest, I'd say, in Jerusalem's landscape in the late Second Temple period. The main point of interest is the temple down here. And the second point of interest is the Siloam Pool. Now, you remember I mentioned before, the Siloam Pool receives the waters of the spring, and it collects them in a very, very large pool. But in this period of the Second Temple period, 2,000 years ago, the importance of the spring was a much more symbolic importance, a much more ritual importance than actual sustenance, because a new technology had developed known as aqueducts. And aqueducts, which is basically comes into play roughly about 2,100, 2,150 years ago, can move water from place to place. As long as that water is going downhill, the water can basically be moved. And so in Jerusalem, we can supply the upper areas of the Temple Mount and the upper city with water without having to go down to the pool or to the spring and collect that water. And so this water has more of a symbolic, spiritual aspect to it. And if you would have been arriving in Jerusalem, not in October 2021, but in October 51, then what you would have done is you would have entered the city from its southern gate down here. You would have stopped at the Siloam Pool to refresh yourself, possibly purify yourself. And then you would have begun your march up this very, very steep stepped street in order to reach one of the entrances into the Temple Mount. We know today of entrances along, a major entrance along the southern wall known as the Hulda Gate, and 4 entrances along the eastern wall. Here you can take a look at our excavations of this street. And this street is a very, very massive street. It's built of very, very beautifully carved stones. This is not some cheap little pathway. At its narrowest point, it's about 8 meters wide. The stones are about 40 to 50 centimeters thick, and it runs for a length of about 600 meters, okay? Our rough estimations speak about 10,000 tons of stone in order to build the street that you had to carve, and you had to move into place, and you had to build infrastructure to hold it up. And it's not just the street itself, because beneath the street is the drain system, which is just as you'd have today. All the dirty water that you don't keep gets drained beneath the street and runs out of the city. And we've exposed this street for a length of some 200, 250 meters thus far, and hopefully we'll actually continue this project after COVID dies down. We're still working on it, but at a much slower pace right now. But our plan is that basically when tourists arrive at the site, they will actually be able to recreate those steps that a pilgrim would have done 2,000 years ago, and enter the city at its southern point, see the Siloam Pool, and march along this stepped street up until all the way into the old city. Now, if you see this probe here, you can see that here there isn't a stone of the street. We actually excavated beneath the street, and this yielded some interesting information, because what we got beneath the street is material that we can use in order to date the building of the street. And in this case, we have something that's even better than radiocarbon dates, and that's coins. As I mentioned before, coins often have a year on them, and we can actually pinpoint very specifically the building activities according to the dates on the coins. And the coins that we got out of this probe date to 3031 CE. Now, 3031 CE is well after Herod's death. Herod dies in 4 BCE. And so, although many of the building projects in Jerusalem are attributed to Herod, here we see that Herod may have planned it on paper, or his architects may have planned it on paper, but he did not build the street. And the person who seems to be the person pushing for the building and completing the project was none other than Pontius Pilate, that same Pilate who is known for the crucifixion of Jesus. And because of that crucifixion, he is very, very often characterized very negatively in the historical sources. But what we are realizing is that although he may have done certain things that caused that to happen, he was also involved in important things such as major construction projects in Jerusalem. Here you can see that we are not the first to excavate, and I mentioned this at the beginning, this street. This is a small tunnel of 2 excavators in the late 19th century that exposed portions of the street. But as I mentioned before, the main thing that we do is when we approach this evidence, we try to build on what they knew and add new methods which they didn't have. And so our dating of the street is much, much better than what they would have known back then. And here you can see the stones of collapse that cover over the street, the collapse of 70 CE as documented in Josephus, that the Romans, after destroying the temple and the Temple Mount, burned Jerusalem all the way to the Siloam Pool. And these are the stones that collapsed and covered over the street from the buildings on either side of it. Here you could see the coins that I mentioned before. And here you could see a small glass perfume bottle, which we found right next to this very, very interesting podium structure built on the street. What this podium was used for, we're not exactly sure. Unfortunately, we didn't find it with a big sign saying, this is what this is. But what we imagine is that the podium was used for someone or something to stand on and attract the attention of the thousands and thousands of pilgrims that would have been marching up the street. And if I mentioned before the use of new methods that weren't in the past, you can see this very, very large heap of stones. And within a very, very large heap of stones, we find a very, very rich collection of these small little dots. And these small little dots are actually not dots, but they're burnt seeds. And they're very, very important because these burnt seeds, first of all, tell us what people were eating in Jerusalem on the eve of its destruction. But they don't just tell us what they were eating, but they actually come into play in understanding the events leading up to that destruction. Now, when we read Josephus, we see that he describes the city is in a great famine at the time of the Jewish rebellion and during the siege and then the destruction. And he describes that there's no food in the city. And he describes horrors, and I won't get into it, but basically we're finding that there is food in the city, and there's not just a little bit. We're finding tons and tons and tons of remains. And we started questioning, what can this mean? And we're still trying to figure it out, and I don't think we have 100% of an answer. But one of the things that we're coming to realize is that perhaps we need to take a better look at what Josephus says, because Josephus describes the bad guys in the story. And for Josephus, the bad guys are the zealots. They're the Jews who are trying to pull everyone along against the Romans. Obviously, Josephus is writing under Roman rule, and so he wants to be careful there. And so he's not writing that the Romans are the bad guys, but he's also Jewish, and so he doesn't want to write that the Jews are the bad guys. So he blames the zealots a lot. And one of the things that he blames the zealots for is accusing innocent people of hiding food, and these zealots run around and burn the storerooms, the so-called empty storerooms of these people who are innocent and weren't hiding food. And what we may be seeing here is that there was food, and these zealots who are running around accusing people of hiding food or of not sharing food may actually have been right. I'm not going to go into this because I believe I'm running pretty much out of time, right?
We're getting there, yes.
Okay, so I want to skip ahead, and I want to talk past the destruction to the last point of excavation that I'll be talking about today, and that's the excavations beneath Wilson's Arch. As I mentioned before, there are 4 entrances that we know of along the Western Wall. And if you've been to Jerusalem and you've been to the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, you've been to this little small square right here. But the actual length of the Western Wall is much, much longer than that. And along this 250-meter segment, we have 4 entrances into the Temple Mount. The 2 lower entrances, known as Barclay's Gate and Warren's Gate, and the 2 upper entrances held up by arches, Robinson's Arch, and Robinson's Arch unfortunately collapsed in the 70 CE destruction, and Wilson's Arch, which held up an entrance, and Wilson's Arch still stands to this day. And although up until recently, there were very, very fierce arguments about the date of when Wilson's Arch, as we see it today, was constructed, we now know 100% that Wilson's Arch was constructed in the Second Temple period, and it stands to date. So we're talking about an arch standing to a height of some 10 meters that was built roughly 2,000 years ago and still stands and still actually supports the entrance into the Temple Mount, because if you walk along the old city, you end up walking along the street of the chain, which follows the same path, and you enter the entrance known as the Gate of the Chain in order to enter the Temple Mount. Now, beneath the area of Wilson's Arch here, you can see a picture of Wilson's Arch. A synagogue was established after 1967. It's part of the Western Wall Plaza Praria, And if you arrive at the Western Wall Plaza on a rainy day or on a very hot day, you may want to pray inside. And so back in the early days following the Six-Day War, and a synagogue was established beneath the arch. And that synagogue basically prevented any excavation up until a few years ago, where a plan was put together to drill in 8 columns, which could hold the synagogue up and allow us to excavate beneath it. And what we exposed were a lot of layers, but I want to jump to probably what is the highlight, and this, which is a new segment of the Western Wall, which hadn't seen light for some 1700 years, is not the big exciting find, because we knew it was there. And this, which is the arch, which is the pier of the arch, the wall which held up the arch, is exciting, but there's something more exciting, and it's this structure. And as you can see here, as we began to expose it, the structure had a sort of round shape to it, and we started wondering what this could be. And as we went on, we realized that we were exposing what is a small theater or theater-like complex in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem's theaters were documented historically both by Josephus for the Second Temple period and in later historical sources for the period after 70 CE, because after 70 CE, Jerusalem does not remain empty. The Romans, after conquering Jerusalem and destroying it, leave behind a garrison of soldiers known as the 10th Legion. And that legion remains in Jerusalem and slowly develops the site into a civilian settlement. And that civilian settlement, after about 60 years of development, is granted the status of being a Roman colony. The Emperor Hadrian actually renames Jerusalem. He calls it Aelia Capitolina. And in 130 CE, he arrives in Jerusalem, declares Jerusalem as a Roman colony. And as a Roman colony, Jerusalem needed Roman-style buildings. And that's what we're looking at here, is one of these buildings. You can see here the curved wall, which would have encompassed the orchestra. Back here where my mouse is moving is where the very, very important people would have sat. And here are steps going up to what would have been rows of seats in order to see something going on in the stage area, which is, I'll see if you can see it here. You have the stage area back here. One of the most interesting things about this structure that we found is that it was never completed. Now, we can't be 100% sure, and we can't even be 50% sure. There may be many, many reasons that the structure was not completed at that time, but several pop up into mind. First of all, one of them could be the same reason that you have today for structures not being completed, which is money runs out, or there was a technical flaw which stopped the construction. But a more historically attractive scenario would actually be to link to the historic events that we know happened here. Now, we know this building dates to roughly the time of the declaration of Aelia Capitolina. And what we suggest is it's possible that the construction of this building was ongoing during the time when Aelia Capitolina was declared and during the event that happens 2 years after that, because there are not Jews in Jerusalem at that time, but there's Jews living in the area surrounding Jerusalem. And they're not so happy about Hadrian changing Jerusalem's name from Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina and making it into a Roman colony. And they revolt for a second time. The second revolt, known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, is quite a serious event. And it's possible that what we're looking at is we're catching that exact moment in history where the Roman legion is constructing buildings in Roman Jerusalem, and then the revolt breaks out, and they have to leave Jerusalem to deal with that revolt, only coming back some 3 years later and possibly changing plans due to many, many reasons. I think at this point, I'm gonna leave it to questions. I'm gonna open it up to questions. I hope that you enjoyed and things were clear.
Thank you. So would you unshare the screen and we'll have time for a few
Okay.
questions. And while you're doing that, let me start with a few. So let me look this way actually. First is, were you in charge of, are you working on the rest of the tunnels that many of us have seen that opened up in the last, I don't know how many years it's been, 10 years or so? Go in and
Uh,
see, what's under the current city, and you can walk through the tunnels by the Kotel.
yes, so the excavation that I just showed you is actually my part in the excavation of the tunnels. The tunnels were excavated, first of all, they were excavated back in the 19th century, partially by the likes of Charles Warren, the British explorers arriving in Jerusalem. More recently, they were excavated by Dan Bahat, and then afterwards by Alexander Ron and Shlomit Fexer-Bdolach of the Israel Antiquities Authority. My excavation is the last link in that, and it's actually the last arch prior to entering into the Temple Mount. So hopefully the next time you come here in October 2021, if you go to the Western Wall tunnels, you'll be able to walk through this area.
When will we be able to walk on the part of the road that you showed us in the city of David that you're excavating right now?
That's an excellent question. I would have liked to say that I would like to say that by October 2021, when you come, at least part of that road will be opened up. Basically, we exposed a very, very lengthy segment of it, and now it's at the point of design. So once we finish our excavation, basically you need a team to come in and design the whole, I'd say the background, make everything pretty, the lighting and so on and so forth. And so that's where it stands now. Because of the virus, of course, the pandemic right now, everything is sort of, with a question mark. But hopefully, I believe that by October 2021, you'll be able to walk parts of that road.
Well, as friends of Ahuva Ho, which makes us special friends of yours, can we arrange a private, special tour of this, even though it's not open to the public, or is it
Yes,
only? Oh, we can do that.
yes, for
So
sure.
when we come, the people who are coming on
Yeah.
our trip, and can you meet us there? Is that something we can arrange? Is that,
Yes, and
we
I
have
see
about a year and a
Ahuva,
bit to.
Ahuva smiling. Now I see
Okay.
Ahuva.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yes, you can definitely contact me
Okay.
and I can,
But we're on it.
again,
We
hoping,
like to do things that other people don't get to do, and with
okay.
VIP tours, so it's, very important
Mhm.
to us. Someone asked a good question. You talked about the different water source that was available via the aqueduct. Is that from a different spring or a different water source? The same water source that fed the pool down below?
No, so it's from different water sources. That's an excellent question. Thank you. Um, Basically, Jerusalem is not the highest hill in the vicinity. If we go further to the south to the areas of the Hebron Hills, the area of modern Gush Etzion, there are natural springs which basically would have fed the aqueduct. Now, because the height of these areas is actually higher than Jerusalem itself, the aqueducts would basically run the water at a very, very slight slope and take it towards the higher areas of Jerusalem, such as the Temple Mount. The spring that I spoke about at the beginning, which is at the base of the hill, basically you can't run it upwards. Water won't go upwards. And
Mhm.
so basically you would have had to gone down to fetch your water like Jack and Jill, or basically Jack and Jill
Okay,
go
but
down to the
it's
well.
a different water
You get
source.
what
I
I'm
think that
saying.
was the question. Carl Cedar wants to know what
Different
archaeologists like
water
you.
source. Yes.
Right. Carl Cedar wants to know what archaeologists like you think of James Michener's The Source and Macaulay's Motel of the Mysteries. Does that
Oh,
question resonate with you in any way?
I admit I have not read, so I cannot, I cannot, yeah, I know. I get that face all the time. No, I have not read.
We will send you both
I
books. I'll
will,
have Carl put them in the mail this afternoon, so don't worry.
okay. I will admit that I will say this. When I was reading books that weren't, I'd say scientific books, when I found the time to do it, I would always run off to faraway places. I love archaeology, but I also want to, you know, get away from it every once in a while. And so, a lot of Tom Clancy stuff. That's that would be more my pick.
Are there any books about ancient Jerusalem that you have read that you would recommend to people who want to learn more about the city
First
and
of
the
all,
history?
yes. First of all, Ronnie Reich's book called "Excavating the City of David" is an excellent book in summarizing the history of the excavations, the history of the site. It's written in a very, very readable manner, and so I very, very highly recommend it. I also highly recommend to follow the press, because the press has taken great interest in archaeology, and specifically in archaeology of Jerusalem. And so every time now, or not every time, but a lot of the time that we release or publish a scientific article, there'll be a press release alongside it. And the press release will usually summarize it in a way that's, more easily read without all the minute and somewhat tedious details.
Do the stuff that you found that you showed us, the coins, the stamps, where do we go to see them when we go to Jerusalem? Which museum
Uh,
are they in?
no, first of all, I'll say this. The material that we have found is now at the moment stored in the IA storerooms. It's not on display at all.
Can you show
Museums
us
are,
that as a CSP VIP opportunity?
that's a little bit more complicated,
Okay, so
possibly,
definitely yes.
possibly here
Okay,
and
good.
there.
Yeah.
But what I can say is that if there are finds, I'll put it differently. Right now, the city of David is in the midst of planning a sort of museum section on the site, and that museum will house many of the finds that we've found in our excavations. And so hopefully, and that's a little bit farther away than, a year and a half, but hopefully at some point down the line, you'll be able to include in your tour a view of some of the important finds that we found in our excavations.
Most of us who visited Jerusalem, and I speak for myself, not for Ahuva or other experts, really spend our time in and around the Western Wall and now the tunnels. Not many of us spend time in the city of David. Is that really worth the time as a layperson? And I assume we need a special guide to that. Yeah.
Oh, yes. No. The city of David is very, very, very worth the time. First of all, walking through the Silwan Tunnel, and whether, I won't get into I believe it is Hezekiah who carves it, but there are opinions that it may be a little bit later. It's still in the first temple. To walk through that feat of 533 meters carved in the rock in order to move water from one place to the next, it's incredible. Seeing the street, which will hopefully be part of the tour, is also going to be incredible. But for those who don't go on the street, you can walk along the Second Temple period drainage channel, which runs beneath the street. And this drainage channel is not a small pipe. This is a drainage channel which you can walk fully straight up and basically find your way into the old city. And so there's a lot to see there.
Have you figured out, there was a question, have you figured out how they built that tunnel, like what they used, what technology they had back then?
Well, first of all, we have not really figured it out completely, and there are various suggestions. There's a suggestion by some geologists that they were actually following a natural fissure in the rock, a natural crack in the rock. And we know that there are these cracks in the rocks because geologically, the rock formations have water seep through them and eat away at the rock. And so that's one possibility. And we also have the inscription, which was found on the wall of the tunnel, which also describes that basically you had two teams working towards each other, which makes it even much more complicated because it's not just one team working in one direction. You have two teams working in either direction. And it's possible that they had people on the outside sort of banging on the rock and making noise to sort of follow the sound. So these are just a couple of the suggestions, but it really is challenging to understand ancient technologies. For later periods, for example, in the Roman period, we have a Roman architect who describes a lot of the technologies they were using for construction. But for earlier periods, we just don't have it.
There was a question asked talking about teams. How many people do you have on your team these days that are doing the archaeological digs with you?
So there are roughly right now in the area of the city of David, the Western Wall Plaza, the Western Wall tunnels, there, I'd say roughly we're about 15 archaeologists working. The number of workers, we have a lot of workers working with us, changes from day to day. I give rough estimates of roughly about 60 to 100 people. All of this is true, of course, of pre-pandemic. With the pandemic, everything is just sort of up in the air. We are still continuing the excavations, but on a much smaller scale right now until hopefully things die down in order to follow with the guidelines that we're giving about the amount of people that can congregate and so on.
And what's your title right now in the Israel
Well,
Antiquities
right now,
Authority?
about 4 months or 5 months ago, I actually stopped most of my excavations in the city of David. I only continue the excavations around the area of the spring together with other archaeologists. And I took on the position of managing the Dead Sea Scrolls unit. Many of you who have visited Jerusalem have probably visited the Israel Museum and the Shrine of the Book, which holds the 7 scrolls, which were, I'd say, the original scrolls, but they're actually only a very, very small part of the collection. At the Israel Antiquities Authority, we have roughly 1,000 manuscripts made up of 25,000 fragments. And in order to preserve these, conserve these, study these, and so on and so forth, we basically have a team put together in order to make sure, first and foremost, that their condition remains at least steady and doesn't get worse. Because upon their discovery in the 40s and 50s and a little bit into the 60s, a lot of damage was done to the scrolls. And so right now we're trying to undo that damage.
Okay. Last few questions before we wrap up. Monty Krieger asks a question, but I think you've answered it. City of David has been claimed not to be real, archaeologically, but rather politically, religiously motivated, which I assume I assume you're involved in, or not directly, but indirectly, your finds are go to the source of conflict as to how many years, how far back do Jewish claims go to the old city, and does that tie into the city of David as well? But I think you've given us evidence that there's a lot of history there.
There's a lot of history. There's history in the city of David itself. There's history running back. Actually, the earliest finds date from about 15,000 years ago. But the earliest architecture dates from about roughly 5,000 years ago. And the city of David as ancient Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, we have evidence from the 9th century onward. And as I mentioned before, we really don't have a lot of solid evidence for the 10th century. That doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't there. There are claims against the excavations in the city of David. The City of David National Park is run by the Elad Foundation. The Elad Foundation is a right-wing group and has been accused of, I would say, right-wing propaganda, Judaizing the remains. I could tell you that the excavations that go on in the city of David are of the highest scientific caliber that we can demand. They are not run by the Elad Foundation. They are run by archaeologists of the Israel Antiquities Authority. as Tel Aviv University, because they're also involved. And we collaborate with universities in Israel and around the world. And we're doing the best science out there, and we're getting published in the highest scientific journals out there. So I think we can shift from saying that the excavations aren't yielding important scientific information. They completely are.
Last two things. David Phillips wants to know, for Hezekiah's tunnel, is there a coin that can date it for us? You may have mentioned that, but I'll ask the question anyway to get a clear answer.
So Hezekiah's tunnel dates to, whether we date it to the 8th century BC or the 7th century BC, it's before coins begin to appear. Amos Frumkin, who is a professor at Hebrew University, did try to do some radiometric dating. The problem is that we know roughly the time period. In order for the fine tuning, there isn't right now, at least, good enough science in order to be able to tell whether it was built in 701 BCE or whether it was built in 690 BCE. And in that sense, we have a lot of arguments amongst scholars. Those who would prefer to date it to different periods use different considerations. My consideration in dating it to Hezekiah does return to the biblical text, because in this case we have a scenario where there are 3 different mentions of Hezekiah moving the water in 3 different books, in Kings, in Isaiah, and in Chronicles. Now, Chronicles in general, from a perspective of biblical scholarship, is of course considered a later composition, but Kings often has at least historical cores in it. And so if we have 3 different mentions in 3 different books, there seems to be some kind of logic, at least in my mind, in dating it to the period of Hezekiah. And it fits well with this whole, I'd say, international political scenario going on of the Assyrian armies, the Assyrian Empire running around, destroying cities and laying them to waste, and Jerusalem somehow surviving it.
Okay. Last question, which I assume, I can probably assume the answer, but any chance, any time soon, you're going to have the opportunity to dig under the Temple Mount area?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
So we should not send Ahuva there with one of those trowels.
No. The Temple Mount, first of all, is a very, very obviously sensitive place, but it's not just that it's a sensitive place. From a legal perspective, it is actually not under our jurisdiction, because the antiquities law in Israel gives us authority over archaeological remains everywhere except for religious compounds. And so basically the Temple Mount as a religious compound is not really directly in our jurisdiction. That said, in 1999, there was a very, very large building project undertaken by the Waqf on the Temple Mount, which saw a lot of press go around about whether they were damaging archaeological remains or not damaging archaeological remains. Subsequent to that, a very large sifting project was undertaken in order to sift all the earth which they had dumped out of the Temple Mount. And since that point in time, there's been a lot more, I'd say, coordination between the Waqf, which basically runs the Temple Mount, and the Israel Antiquities Authority, where we basically have a better idea of what's going on there, and things are done in proper coordination.
Right. Well, thank you. I hope, if you don't mind, you can share some of those images, particularly with the aerial images of ancient Jerusalem, because I just found that very helpful to see from the pool up the road. So that would be great to share with our people. And I hope to see you in person, I guess, a year from October on our VIP private tour of the city of David, and to look at the antiquities in your apartment, in the basement of the antiquities building. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ahuva, for the recommendation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We went a little long, but I think it was worth it. And have a great day. We'll see you Thursday night, Danny, Matt, and the Zohar, and on Friday you'll get invited to our Friday musical event. Don't worry, Rochelle, it's coming soon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joe. Bye-bye. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Sorry I
Bye-bye.
turned off all your videos, but I tried to turn off videos so that we could save on the bandwidth. We were having some challenges. Okay, everybody. Have a great one. Bye, Dale. See you soon. Let's see if I can even turn this off today.